What are the tenants' rights in New York?
The landlord can turn around as long as he gives you enough notice prior to the termination of that lease and say, hey, listen, I'm increasing your rent by $1,000 a month. There's nothing to stop him from doing that.
ল্যান্ডলর্ডের কর্তব্য যে অ্যাপার্টমেন্টটা বা বাড়িটা ভাড়া দেওয়া হয়েছে সেখানে লিভেবল হয়। বিভিন্ন মেয়াদের লিজের বিভিন্ন মেয়াদের নোটিশ আসে, নোটিশ দিলে তারে বলে যাওয়া যাবে না তুমি চলে যাও।
A tenant's landlord topic. I know for many of us this is not as pleasant as it sounds, and it's a painful process for many of us.
Sure.
But let's start with one fundamental thing, and then we'll go back to Sheikh Salim just to get some more clarity.
Absolutely.
Because everybody needs to understand this. What are the tenants' rights in New York? We're talking about New York in general. You can segment that saying, hey, this 5 boroughs is different from these 2 counties.
Right.
That's up to you.
Actually, the 5 boroughs, all 5 counties of New York are the same. It's a little different when you get outside of New York City. So Yonkers, Nassau, Suffolk, they have Westchester. I mean,
right.
they have some different laws. There are additional laws within New York, like the rent stabilization law within New York City. However, I mean, tenants' rights is pretty broad, but when you're dealing with eviction, you're dealing with a process, and landlords are precluded in a lot of ways. Actually, let me refine that. So there are several types of summary proceedings, which is what they call an action in court to evict somebody that a landlord could bring. The 2 most common are non-payment proceedings and summary holdover proceedings. So a non-payment proceeding is when you owe a lot of money in rent and they say, well, we're bringing you to court to collect the rent, and if you don't pay it, then we're going to evict you, and this is what we're trying to do. And then there's a summary holdover proceeding, which is essentially either you committed a violation of the lease, so if your lease is still active and it hasn't expired yet, then if you breach the lease or violate the lease or commit certain other acts that are precluded under the law, then the landlord can bring that action against you, but that's a much more difficult action for a landlord to prosecute than say, well, if the lease expired and you're not getting out and he doesn't want to continue to renew you, if you're on a market rate lease, then the landlord has no obligation to give you a new lease. And at that point, the landlord can simply serve you notice and then bring you to court to evict you.
Okay, this is the process for eviction, non-payment and procedural. But what are the rights, tenants' rights? If you were to say these are the 5 or 10 or 2 rights
right.
that they're entitled to.
The most fundamental right is the warranty of habitability. It's not so much a right as much as it's an obligation of the landlord to make sure that the apartment is fit to be lived in. It's fit for habitation. And that means heat and hot water. That means working plumbing. That means electricity. That means free from vermin and pests and rodents and roaches. That means that the structural integrity of the unit is safe. There are no violations of code. You have multiple means of egress, which is exit in the event of emergency, depending on when the building was built, whether or not the building code required a retrofitting, say, for sprinkler systems or interior fire safety prevention. So these are all rights that the tenants have. The tenants also are free have the right against rent gouging. So, a lot of the times landlords will unnecessarily jack up the rent. Now, when you are in regulated housing, then those rents are capped and those rents are regulated and the landlords can't. But people who are unsophisticated and don't realize that they have a regulated lease can be the victims of that. If you're in a market rate apartment and there are no regulations on it, then the landlords can change the rent anytime after the lease expires. So you have a lease for a year, say for $1,500 a month, and the landlord learns that he's been undercharging you and he could get $2,500 a month at the expiration of that lease. The landlord can turn around as long as he gives you enough notice prior to the termination of that lease and say, hey, listen, I'm increasing your rent by $1,000 a month. There's nothing to stop him from doing that.
Okay, so I think this is where we want to hear more from Sheikh Salim. Sheikh Salim, আমরা ডিসকাস করছিলাম টেনেন্টস রাইটস। আপনি যদি একটু পরিষ্কার করে বলেন আমাদের সবার জন্য, যারা ভিউয়ার্স আছেন এখন দেখছেন পরে দেখবেন, সবার জন্য সুবিধা হবে।
শিওর। ইন এ লিজড অ্যাপার্টমেন্ট, যারা ইজারা নেয় অ্যাপার্টমেন্ট থাকে, তাদের রাইট, মানে তাদের ল্যান্ডলর্ডের কর্তব্য যে অ্যাপার্টমেন্টটা বা বাড়িটা ভাড়া দেওয়া হয়েছে সেখানে লিভেবল হয়, অর্থাৎ হিট, হট ওয়াটার, ইলেকট্রিসিটি, ওয়ার্কিং কন্ডিশনস, কোন রকমের হ্যাজার্ড কন্ডিশন নাই, সেইটাই একটা। অফকোর্স টেনান্টস হ্যাজ দ্যাট রাইট, তার ভালোভাবে বাস করার মতো উপযোগী অ্যাপার্টমেন্ট সেইটা। তারপরে টেনান্টের টেনান্ট মানে কোনো প্রকার ল্যান্ডলর্ডের থেকে কোনো প্রকার উস্কানি বা ধরেন ইন্টারফারেন্স করতে পারবে না, এগুলো সব টেনান্টসের রাইট আছে। এবং কাকরোচ, রোচেস, নিট অ্যান্ড ক্লিন, সেটা তাদের ব্যাপার, নিট অ্যান্ড ক্লিন রাখবে, তাই না? যে বাস করে সে তার রেসপন্সিবিলিটি। তারা আননেসেসারিলি নোটিশ ছাড়া বিভিন্ন মেয়াদের লিজের বিভিন্ন মেয়াদের নোটিশ আছে, নোটিশ দ্বারা তারা বলে যাওয়া যাবে না তুমি চলে যাও। যেগুলো আনরেগুলেটেড 1 to 5 ফ্যামিলি হাউসেস, এখানে রেগুলেশন নাই, এটা রেন্ট ইনক্রিজ করতে পারে লিজ শেষ হওয়ার পরে এনি অ্যামাউন্ট, সেখানে কোনো ক্যাপ নাই। কিন্তু রেগুলেটেড অ্যাপার্টমেন্ট যেগুলা রেন্ট স্টেবিলাইজ, সেখানে ক্যাপ আছে, এই কয় পার্সেন্টের বেশি বাড়ানো যায় না। এবং মোর দেন 6 ফ্যামিলি হইলে সেখানে কেউ থাকলে দে হবে, তাদের রাইট আছে লিজ রিনিউ করার, and landlord সেটা রিফিউজ করতে পারে না রিনিউ করলে, as long as they pay rent। তারা রেন্ট পে করলে তাদের ইভিক্ট করা খুবই কঠিন ব্যাপার।
থ্যাংক ইউ।
আরেকটা বলছেন নন পেমেন্ট, নন পেমেন্ট প্রসিডিং, সেখানে পেমেন্ট না দিলে যে কেউ ল্যান্ডলর্ড যে ইভিকশন প্রসিডিং করে তাদের ইভিক্ট করতে পারে।
জি,
সেখানে হয়তো ভ্যারিয়াস ডিফেন্স থাকে বিভিন্ন ভাবে, যে কি সিচুয়েশনে পারে, আবার পেমেন্ট দিয়ে দিলে আবার ইয়ে করতে পারে না। আরেকটা বলছে যে এক্সপায়ার্ড লিজ, শেষে সেখানে যদি তারা ল্যান্ডলর্ড ইলেক্ট করতে পারে লিজ টার্মিনেট করে দেবে।
জি,
হোল্ড ওভার প্রসিডিং, যে হোল্ড করতেছে লিজ এক্সপায়ার হওয়ার পরে হোল্ড ওভার প্রসিডিং করতে পারে। ইউজুয়ালি নন রেগুলেটেড যেগুলোতে নিয়ন্ত্রিত বাড়ি না বা অ্যাপার্টমেন্ট না, সেখানে তাদের ইভিক্ট করতে পারে।
ওকে,
কিন্তু যদি রেগুলেটেড হয় তাইলে আবার ইভিক্ট করা কঠিন ব্যাপার হয়ে দাঁড়ায়।
ওকে, সো জাস্ট সো দ্যাট আমরা সবাই বুঝি, 1 to 5 ফ্যামিলি অ্যাপার্টমেন্টগুলো ইটস নট রেগুলেটেড। যদি 6-এর উপরে চলে যায় যে বিল্ডিং গুলো আছে রেগুলেটেড,
6 বা
6 and
You
up.
need 6. You need 6.
And that's when, I mean, 1 to 5, the landlord can raise the landlord যে কোনো পরিমাণ ভাড়া বাড়াতে পারে, আপনি মানা করতে পারবেন না। কিন্তু 6 and up, there is a regulation.
Right. There's one thing I want to add to that also. So when your apartment is regulated under rent stabilization law, there's another fundamental right that tenants have, and that is the right to renew the lease. So in an unregulated apartment, the landlord doesn't have to renew the lease. They just say, listen, your lease is expiring. As long as they give enough notice, I'm not intending to renew your lease. Thank you very much. And they don't even need to give a reason necessarily. On a regulated apartment under rent stabilization law, the landlord is required to offer a renewal lease between 150 and 90 days prior to the expiration of the lease. Now, if you don't renew the lease and you don't sign it for whatever the reason, then the landlord has an opportunity or has the right to evict you as a holdover. However, if you can show a reason why you didn't sign it, I was injured, I was sick, I was in the hospital, I didn't get it, and the landlord didn't serve it on time, or whatever it is, the courts are very generous with saying, listen, you know, his reasons are valid, and all you have to do is sign the lease, and then that's the end of that case.
I have a very relevant question.
Sure.
Many of the questions. One, I must take this. Jenny Hassan, আমি আপনার প্রশ্নটি নিচ্ছি. He wrote, my brother's tenant is not paying rent for the last 3 years. Why the eviction process is so biased? why would it blindly support the tenant and don't think of the law needs to a lot of revision, corrections, or upgrade? Yeah, that part I agree.
Wow. Well, first of all, I mean, if I'm looking at it from 30,000 feet, I only have limited information.
Correct.
I will tell you this: the landlord-tenant laws in New York are construed from the perspective of protecting the tenant first. That said, what I tell clients is the only thing the court really has to give out right now is time, and the court is giving out a lot of time. One, because the dockets are full and the courts are overloaded, especially after COVID, when you had a whole slew of foreclosure act. I mean, not foreclosure of evictions
yes.
Being commenced or resumed after the moratoria were lifted. But it takes that long because you're also dealing with issues of due process. So when you're dealing with property rights, if you lease an apartment, even if you're not paying rent, you have a property right in that lease. You have a property right in the occupancy of that apartment. So that's protected by due process, which means that you're entitled to an attorney. If you can't afford an attorney, then the court will appoint one. Or they'll actually make a referral. The court won't appoint it. They'll make a referral to an organ or multiple organizations that provide pro bono or free legal advice or free legal representation. It's no guarantee that they'll be able to accept you. The point I'm making is that it's designed to give the tenant every opportunity to fight and contest and defend in these actions. And unfortunately, the landlords pay the brunt of that. And when you are a homeowner and it's a two-family home and you're trying to make a little extra money on your home to help pay the mortgage and you're just a working person like anybody else, that's the most unfortunate part. You're not some big management company that's bringing in, hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in rent, and you can afford, okay, this one particular tenant isn't paying. It's just a drop in the bucket.
Right. I'm just going to tell Janib Hassan, I don't know, just like Mr. Zarco was saying, he doesn't have all the details. We just have two pieces of information. That's 3 years he's not paying rent and what is happening, right? So in order to really get some help, one thing is you need a good lawyer. That's for sure. Your brother should reach out to Zarco's office. And I'm not, pushing for any sales. Because based on my conversation with him, I know what I hear. আমি জানি ওনার সাথে আমার অনেক কথাবার্তা হয় এবং based on those discussions আমি জানি ওনার expertise-টা কি. So have him call him.
You also have, I'm sorry, I just want to interject
3 years, 3 years is too long.
One second.
You also have to remember that 3 years ago we were still in the middle of COVID.
Correct.
And
that's
so there was an eviction moratorium
we don't know what happened there,
on
right?
non-payment of rent.
Correct.
You also have the possibility, well, if he hasn't paid rent in years, then, he could have applied for ERAP funds. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't.
But
nonetheless, the courts were, and eviction actions were stayed. There was a moratorium on it for failure to pay rent.
So there are issues that we don't know. There are things that we don't know.
Right.
We don't know what took place. Is he part of the ERP applicants? We don't know.
Right.
Right. So best thing is to get a good lawyer, please. 3 years is too long. Sheikh Salim, আপনি কিছু বলছিলেন খুব দ্রুত কারণ আমি আরেকটি
না আমি বলছি যে 3 years is too long.
Right.
আমাদের কাছে enough information নাই কেন 3 years এ তারা রাখছে.
Correct.
It's unlikely যে 3 years লোকজন থাকতে পারে without payment. There might be other issue we don't know.
All right.
নিউইয়র্ক থেকে সম্প্রচারিত TBN 24 টেলিভিশন বিশ্বজুড়ে বাঙালির কণ্ঠস্বর.